So welcome everybody to the 8th session of the Financial History Network webinar series. Today we have the honor of hosting Dr. Frederick Steinfeld. He will be presenting his paper, Managing the Balance Sheet, Hidden Reserves, Dividend Smoothing, and Balance Manipulation in the German Chemical Industry around 1900. Dr. Steinfeld is a postdoctoral researcher at the Unit for Economic History at the School of Business, Economics and Law, University Gothenburg. He holds a PhD from Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany, which he received for a thesis about the financial and accounting history of the German chemical industry, 1863 to 1916. His research interest lies within the 19th and 20th century economic and business history, with a special focus on financial and accounting history, as well as the history of economic thought. The webinar is divided into two parts. First, Dr. Steinfeld will have 30 minutes to present his paper, followed by a Q&A session of 30 minutes as well. We kindly ask you to send us your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will be asking you whether you want to come up and appear as panelists to make the session more interactive. We also remind you that this session is being recorded and will be posted onto our coming YouTube channel. So thank you very much all for being here. And Dr. Steinfeld, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me in this webinar series. And I'm going today to talk about the management of balance sheets in the German chemical industry around the year 1900. I divided my speech into 6 parts. I will start with a short introduction about the paper, about the motivation behind the paper. Then I will briefly talk about past research that has been done on balance sheet manipulation, and especially on the topic of hidden reserves. Then I will give you a bit of a background on the development of management accounting in the German chemical industry, and especially at the company that I looked into in detail, which is Bayer, which probably most of you know. It's the second biggest chemical company still today in Germany, and is most famous for developing the painkiller aspirin. And then I'm actually looking into or presenting you on a more empirical level how balance sheet influencing and manipulation was done within the German chemical industry, what the consequences are or were from this influence and manipulation, and then I will finish up with a conclusion and an outlook for maybe further research that could be done on this topic. So briefly, the introduction and the motivation of this paper. I draw this paper, or this paper draws on results from my dissertation. And in my dissertation, I was looking at the development, or maybe more precisely at the co-development of management accounting and the influence management accounting had on decision-making processes in the German chemical industry. And again, with Bayer being the case, most prominent case example. In doing this research, one of my key findings was the big influence companies had on quantified information that was communicated to outsiders, and outsiders in this context often meaning shareholders, but also the state, for example. And with my paper, I kind of want to relate to a trend that I'm currently observing in research around financial history and the history of financial markets. And this trend is that there's a lot of research that has a heavy focus on information contained in balance sheets, and especially when this information is presented in an aggregated form, meaning in yearbooks, for example, where then scholars from economics, but also from economic and financial and business history take this information out of the yearbooks, digitize them, and then use them as a database. And as I will argue in this paper, I think that this approach can be quite problematic, and this presentation hopefully will show you why. Some words about the past research. The past research on balance sheet manipulation and especially on hidden reserves has had a very strong focus on companies in the US and the UK. And why is that? I assume, or I argue in my dissertation, that this is because both countries have a very strong history when it comes to the accounting history being an own discipline in those countries, which it is not in Germany, for example, which is quite astonishing, I guess, because I think that we have very good business archives in Germany that where this kind of research could really benefit from. So this demand for more research on accounting for German companies has been raised a couple of times now, and I want to add with my paper to this demand. And what the studies in the US and on UK companies basically found out, that there's a proof of companies using hidden reserves as early as the 1880s. But it is argued that those cases are very isolated and not something that happens in entire industries, for example. And this is why hidden reserves as a practice are generally described as a 20th century phenomenon. In Germany, they're described as a phenomenon that starts in the 1920s. What is a bit problematic with this is that while we know that hidden reserves have, that the creation of hidden reserves happened, and we also know how it happened, meaning that it happened by undervaluating assets, by using heavy depreciation in most cases. What is often not possible is to reconstruct the actual amount of hidden reserves. So hidden reserves, or what hidden reserves meant in relationship to other means of financing, so in external financing, debt financing from banks, remains a black box. And so this paper, I hope, delivers a rare case study, not only because it's a very early case study, because it starts in the 1880s, but also because it's actually able to show the importance of internal financing for the companies in German chemical industry. So briefly, the background of management accounting. I argue that the reason for Bayer creating management accounting was basically a company crisis that happened in the middle of the 1880s. So the German, or the chemical industry entirely was a very innovation-driven industry, and Bayer, while it was one of the biggest companies, is somewhat a special case. Because they were not a really innovative company. They were second movers. You could also say that they didn't really have any innovative capabilities at all. So the means to react to this company crisis were very limited on a product level. So the solution they looked for was then to rationalize the production and increase the efficiency of the production. And one of the results was that they started to quantify the processes happening within the firm, and by this established very early forms of management accounting practices. And to maybe sum it up to one phrase, then you could say that the attention of the Bayer management switched from outside markets to the inner organization of the firm. And the result of this switch to the inside of the firm was, as I said, that they had more and more sophisticated flows of information and also more quantified data. And based on this, they established several means of, the management established several means of optimizing the balance sheets. And by optimizing the balance sheet, they were influencing the balance sheet, they were able to increase the information asymmetry between the company on the one hand and the outsiders on the other hand. And this would eventually result in a larger scope for decision-making for the management. And the most important means of this balance sheet manipulation was, as I mentioned earlier, hidden reserves. And hidden reserves created a source of internal financing for the company and allowed it, or the management, to smooth both dividends and profits, and in doing so, kind of disguising the firm's actual performance from outsiders. And what is very important to mention in this context is that there was barely any legal regulation in place at this time. So the stock market law was basically not giving any regulation that would influence the creation of hidden reserves at that time. Coming more to the empirical level now, how did they actually do it? So how was Bayer especially able to create hidden reserves? And this is a picture or a scan from the minutes of the supervisory board from the year 1892. And here they were discussing, they were closing the books for the previous year, so for 1891. And as you can see above, or what is important to mention is, even though it's the minutes of the supervisory board, the distinction between executive board and supervisory board basically did not exist at this time. So both were institutions that were capable of decision making. So as you see on top of the red box is the net profit. You see it's 2.2 million marks. And then what is interesting is the sentence within the box where it's stated that this net profit was calculated after the following positions have been deducted from the profits. And then there comes a list with provisions that are made and put into secret accounts, as well as depreciation. You see, Abschreibung is the German word for depreciation. You can see it here with the amount of 200,000 marks. So these are different means and accounts where money was put before the balance sheet then was published. And when the balance sheet was published, of course, as you can assume, there were no hints of these accounts being where money was transferred to these accounts. So here again, we have the 2.2 million marks on top, and then they just deducted very limited amounts into public pension funds and bonuses. And in the end, you have a net profit after this of 1.6 million marks, and almost the entire amount is then paid as a dividend, and the leftovers are then transferred to the next fiscal year. So as I showed you, the money that was taken away is basically deducted using two instruments, and this is on the one hand provisions, and on the other hand depreciation, meaning hidden reserves. And while in the beginning, so in the early 1890s, the provisions were by far the more important means for internal financing, this switched very quickly. Already in the year 1893, it's basically 50-50. And from then onwards, the depreciation, creating hidden reserve by depreciate assets, really became the by far most important means in order to create internal financing. And it is, so just to clarify, because it's written in German, the hidden reserves or the depreciation is a dark gray, and the provisions is a light gray bar. So what this then leads to is, if you now plot this individual finding for 1 year that I just presented you to the entire years from 1891 to 1903, these are two graphs that results from this. And on top, you have the net profits, including the hidden reserves, and as a black bar, and then as a light gray bar graph, you see the published earnings. And what there are basically three findings that you can make on this plot. And the first one being that the net profits, the real net profits fluctuate a lot. You can see that it's an increasing trend, but you see, especially in the year, not so much in the year 1894, but it decreases here, and there's a large decrease in the year 1898, where there was a big industry-wide crisis because a lot of raw materials became very expensive during this year. But the public did not notice it, because the net profits that were published to the public, they were stable. They were the increase was very slight. So the image that the management presented to the public was the one of a very not so much growing company maybe, but a very reliable company. And so and how did they do it? The management did it by smoothing the profits, and at the same time, which is a second observation, which not is clear from this graph, but as you saw when they calculated dividends, they always orient the dividends towards the earnings. And so when the earnings remain consistent, also the dividend was smoothed during these years. So that's the second observation. And thirdly, what is also interesting when you look at this graph is this increase in earnings that you see at the end. So starting maybe 1900, 1901, is that you see an increase in earnings. And the reason for this is a technical one. And as you always have assets that you need to depreciate in order to create hidden reserves, the company's management had, so to say, the problem around 1900 that a lot of the fixed assets that they were depreciating were already entirely written off. And this is something that you see from this table. You see for different location sites of Bayer that, for example, the buildings in numerous places are written off to a so-called remembrance post of 1 mark. And which is remarkable and interesting is this remembrance posts. They are mentioned in the literature, which really the literature about management accounting is coming into existence around 1900 in Germany. And then as late as 1920, this is mentioned, the remembrance posts are mentioned, and it is stated that having remembrance posts of 1 mark is a sign of sound and good bookkeeping. So the accountants also said that accountants that do not manage to get the assets written down to 1 mark are not doing their job well. So it's really remarkable that Bayer is kind of ahead of the time in this matter. So I identified 3 consequences from the influencing and manipulation of the balance sheets. And the first one is that, as I showed you, they were able to control the expectations of the shareholders because they were able to smooth both the dividends and the profits. So the shareholders could not expect a higher dividend because simply the earnings were not high enough to allow a higher dividend. Secondly, they were able to withdraw from state influence, meaning tax payments, but more importantly, they were withdrawing from bank influence. And this is something that is mentioned a couple of times in the minutes of the supervisory board, and also during a long period of time, that they do not want debt financing, that they refuse this as often as possible, because simply they do not want to have the influence of the banks on the company, and they do not want to be transparent towards the banks. So they rather draw on internal financing when it's possible. And thirdly, what I argue on the paper is that this early sophisticated management accounting that Bayer established somehow also meant a competitive advantage for the company because of its superior cost control that it meant. And this is something that is really well displayed in the year 1903, or the years 1903, 1904. And this is a year where the Bayer and the BASF, the by far dominant company, chemical company from the middle of the 19th century until around 1900, they negotiate to form a syndicate, and they agree to form a syndicate later. And in the process of this negotiation, they disclose the balance sheets towards each other and agree on a mutual calculation method to reevaluate all their assets. And as you see, basically you just need to focus on the total assets on the bottom. As you see, Bayer was the assets of Bayer were twice as valuable as stated in the official balance sheet, and the real balance sheet was 94.8 million compared to 46.8 million. And what is interesting is that the BASF entered the negotiations with the self-understanding that they were the dominant chemical company in Germany, and they would be able to dictate and dominate the negotiations. But once they revealed the numbers towards each other, it turned out that even though also the BASF had some hidden reserves, as you can see from the different calculations of the assets, but the company was the assets were even a bit less valuable than the ones of Bayer. So in the end, Bayer was the more valuable company, and this interestingly made the executive board of Bayer kind of angry. And so one of the members of the executive board, Karl Duisberg, he really got triggered a bit by this because he found this to be a sign of very, very bad management accounting and financial accounting. So he said one has to expect from the leadership of a big stock company, so he directed this directly to the BASF management, that it is able to feel the pulse of its business on a daily basis. And this is obviously something that Karl Duisberg would say the best BASF executives were not able to do. And I think this is the pulse of the business is a very, very nice image to describe what management accounting meant for the Bayer management. So coming to the conclusion and the outlook, and somewhat building the bridge again to what I said in the beginning about the problems of the current research, I kind of identified 3 different approaches when it comes to the influence companies, or to describe the influence the companies had on public information in today's research. And the first one being that scholars know that the manipulation of balance sheets and hidden reserves were a thing, and it happened, but the case studies are so few, and so they really cannot make a broader statement about it. So here I would propose, just coming from my own empirics, that you could maybe add something to this problem or a solution to this problem by looking at situations where a lot of companies come together and negotiate something like mergers or syndicates, because I could imagine that these are crucial moments where this black box of hidden reserves and balance manipulations is opened and some light is shed into it, maybe. So this could be a good point for further research. Then a second approach is that the fact of balance sheet manipulation is unintentionally maybe, but it's neglected by focusing on the wrong parameters. What I mean by this is that scholars sometimes take the numbers too much for granted. What I mean by this is that they look at profits, and when the profits stagnate or are not increasing by much, which for example was the case for Bayer, and the dividends do not increase at the same time, they would just not say that it is profit smoothing or dividend smoothing. They would just assume that the companies did not perform very well. So when taking this stand, you could probably come up with wrong assumptions. And the third approach, if you wanted to call it an approach, is that scholars know about this, about hidden reserves and balance sheet influence, but they ignore it and somehow sacrifice the historical evidence to make a broader statement in regards to the aggregated data they use. And this leads to something that maybe we could discuss, but I think that this kind of leads to an information asymmetry that is persistent somewhat over the course of history. And what I mean by this is that the initial asymmetry of information between the companies and its outsiders, and this in the historical context of course means the company and the shareholders, somewhat remains until today, and that the outside actors today are the scholars looking at the company. And the danger that I identify is that in looking at the numbers, scholars still today are in danger to interpret what the management wanted the outsiders the historical outsiders to see. So the management somewhat created an image of the firm, and scholars today still interpret rather the image of the firm than the actual state of the firm. And this will eventually lead to wrong assumptions about companies' historical performance. And by this, I end my presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and very thought-provoking topic. I am going to start by reading 2 comments, so I will get more questions.
I will stop the presentation, maybe.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, let me just read two comments that we have here, and perhaps you can comment on them. You can extend a bit on them, and we'll move on to the questions. So first, a comment by Bernardo Batis Lazo. He's saying, perhaps I missed it, but I didn't hear a reference to the work of Mark Billings and Forrest Cappy on hidden reserves in British banks. And then we have a comment by Sven Arndt Nielsen Helsingborg. An important background to the practice of hidden reserves in Germany is the reaction to Grundrecht regulation in Aktien Novelle 1884 in the form of the highest allowed valuation of assets. This approach lasted until the 1965 Companies Act, introducing valuation rules instead of highest allowed valuation. So if you can please comment on those. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments. I am familiar with the work of Mark Billings. I'm not familiar with the work of Forrest Cappy. I've read about the British banks, but I will certainly look into it more because the paper is still a work in progress. So I'm very, very happy to get more references if you have some. And yes, what Sven Arne Nilsson is speaking about, it's very much important. I just didn't mention it due to the time in the presentation, but the Aktienrechtsnovelle of 1884 is important. But as I found out in my studies, somehow they even though it was in place since 1884, what was more important for the companies was basically the public reserves that were that the Aktienrechtsnovelle of 1884 would suggest or would make required. Those were more important for the companies. So this is something that then instantly changes. They make this public reserves, but then they stop as soon as the limit is reached for the reserves. But anything above that does not really play an important role for the actual process of hidden reserves. But I will certainly look into it a bit more about when it comes to the valuation approach of this regulation.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask you to start the questions, but we have actually one by Angel Ballarin Garnica. As our first question. So could you detect the same trend in intangible assets and R&D expenses?
So the R&D expenses are not listed individually. It's a very difficult topic. There's a study that really looks into this, like the financing of R&D at Bayer especially, but it's a research that starts in the 1950s, and at least from my observation period, I was not able to trace any expense accounts, separate expense accounts. So it's very hard to tell. And the same goes for intangible assets. I guess they are not really something that are mentioned in the balance sheets or in the internal discussions about the balance sheets.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have a question as well, if I may interject here. Have you thought of framing this around the concept of the agency problem, and how was there a debate among shareholders and beyond that the stakeholders with the company? Did you detect any tensions, or was this just the company managing in the accounts and the stakeholders or the shareholders not noticing it?
It's a bit tricky, I would say, because the agency approach, it's very difficult to identify who's the agent and who's the principal in this context, because a lot of the members of because a lot of the shareholders were at the same time also part of the management, because it's still for some part a family-owned business, but the more equity is raised at the market, of course this relationship changes. So I didn't really look into, agency theory does not really play a very big role in my research.
Thank you very much. Next, we have a question by Trevor Boynes. So let us see if Trevor, can you please turn on your camera and your microphone?
It's doesn't want to start the video for some reason.
For me, it's okay. It's just a microphone. Okay.
Oh, right, there we are.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Bernardo. Yeah, I've understood you to say, and I'm not sure if I heard this correctly, but you seem to imply that all depreciation is equated with hidden reserves.
No, that's that might have been a bit confusing then, but no, there was a usual depreciation that was used to just depreciate the assets, which is also stated in the balance sheets, also in the public balance sheets. But then there was a special depreciation that was happening separately of this.
That makes sense. I mean, I was slightly worried. I mean, I'm currently doing a work on a famous British case of 1906, which involves Birmingham Small Arms and a debate with shareholders over the creation of a secret inner reserve. And I've also got material relating to the archives of that company. So I'm very interested in what you're saying, because it chimes very much with what I'm currently finding at the moment in this particular case study. But yeah, I mean, the other thing, of course, is that depreciation, you talk about cost accounting or management accounting. We can argue about the distinctions between the two if you like, but certainly in the late 19th century, British texts on cost accounting were concerned with the issue of whether or not depreciation is a cost. Now, obviously, the question is, what depreciation are we talking about? Are we talking about the depreciation, you know, that you would consider to be valid, or is it the depreciation which is excessive and therefore becomes a hidden reserve? Again, I've been doing some work on that recently, and I've got a paper that's going through a revise and resubmit. It's been resubmitted, and I'm awaiting on looking at what was happening in the industries of the second industrial revolution, if you like, the motorcycle industry, the cycle industry, and the motor car industry in the early 20th century in Britain. And there are obviously lots of things going on there with regards to how depreciation was charged, the rates charged, etc., etc. So that's more a comment than a question, I'm afraid.
No, but very interesting indeed. I just yeah, it's when it comes to literature, it's really the German. I mean, that's a question that is often raised when I present this case. So what was literature like at this time, and was there already like an academic accounting studies or management accounting? And as far as I found out, the companies were doing this individually for this. So it was people of practice, if you can call them like that. So just people that worked on the companies, and they would publish accounting books about their individual companies. Now it's said my internet is unstable. Do you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is very something that is very interesting to look into. How literature influenced accounting practices in certain companies, but for example, for Bayer, I did not find any evidence of literature influencing the practices. And more interestingly, it was, I mean, you will probably be familiar with the name Schmalenbach, and he was actually referring in later works a lot to practices that already were in place at Bayer many years before he would write about them. So that's this interrelation between literature and practice is really something that that is interesting.
Yes, my own work obviously suggests that there's quite a lot of linkage between practice to literature rather than literature to practice. The literature often follows what was actually going on in the best practice companies, obviously. Mm-hmm. But yes, I think that's probably the case.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for your intervention and question. Next, we have one question by Joachim Book. So I'm going to read it. Very basic question that I didn't understand. What's the benefit for the firm insiders? These are in the times of company tax rates and aggressive tax planning. So to put it bluntly, what's the point of over depreciating assets?
I can argue from the empirical point of view, and this is drawing on the statements that the management gives, and this is that they say that they want to over depreciate their assets in order to create hidden reserves. And the reason for this is what I mentioned in the presentation, is that they do not want to go into debt financing. So they don't want to have banks interfering with their decision-making processes, whenever it's possible, they would want to have means of internal financing rather than other means of financing.
Well, thank you. Next, we have Manuel Bautista. So, Manuel, if you want to turn your camera and microphone, please.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Frederick, for presenting your paper. We were really excited when collectively we decided to have you in the webinar, because we thought it was a really interesting contribution. So I think my questions are somewhat related to your paper, but they arose basically from seeing your presentation. So the first one concerns the role of rumors and business newspapers, scoops and exclusives as a form of market discipline.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you well at the moment. I don't know if it's my connection again.
Okay.
I think it's my connection. I will just.
Yeah, man, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure.
Maybe I will try to put off the.
Sometimes turning off the video might help.
Yeah, I think we lost Frederick for a bit.
No, I'm back.
I'm there. Okay, great.
Okay.
So the question has to do with the role of newspaper exclusives as a form of market discipline. We all sort of remember what happened with the Financial Times coverage and exclusive about the Wirecard scandal in Germany. So my question, which it wasn't covered in the presentation, but I'm just curious if there are any interesting press scandals covered by the German business press regarding Bayer. And then the second question, and I'm going to keep it very brief. How is this financial engineering and accounting strategy related to Bayer's increasing footprint in international markets at the time? I read in the Bayer AG's website that by 1913, 80% of revenues came from exports. And of course, you're talking about an earlier period in the history of the firm. But I am curious what if it had anything to do with, sort of financing that international footprint expansion. And the last question is, what is happening on the regulation front? Who are the regulators who might impose some form of best practices, best accounting practices? I'm curious to learn more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. About the newspapers, that's something I have been looking into recently, especially because I am interested in seeing how this syndicate formation between Bayer and the BASF was covered in newspapers, because when you imagine that the BASF went into negotiations as officially being the twice as big company, and in the end they come out on eye level, I would assume that this would be something that would be astonishing to outsiders. But sadly, I have not found anything so far. But that's something that I'm currently looking into. The internationalization and the demand for funds or for financing does not really play such a role, because the international so basically they export a lot from their from their home market to internationally, and they only create factories where they are forced to do so because of patent law restrictions. So for example, in Russia or in France, where the patent law says that they have the products that are sold on the French and Russian market need to be produced in the country. They create production facilities there. But what is really like the biggest cost driver at this time is that they move their production site in Germany to another spot and create what is then seen as the most advanced chemical plant in Europe, which is happening during the 1890s. So especially exactly during the time where they create this massive amounts of hidden reserves. And the regulation, as I said, is not so much in place at this time. The comment was very well hinting at the 1884 reform of the stock market law. But this actually the hidden reserves, at least what my understanding is, there was something that was not really understood by legislation. And I don't know if you would not have noticed it, but on the published balance sheets that Bayer published during the 1890s, they would always have a post of special depreciation, so official special depreciation. And in the beginning of the 20th century, there's actually the tax authorities coming to Bayer and saying, how does it look with your hidden reserves? We need to tax them. And then they relate to this official special depreciation that they have created, which amounts to about 5 million marks, while the real hidden reserves already amount to 40 million marks by that time. So yeah, they know that they are way ahead in the game when it comes to regulation. And the real regulation then really comes into place in the 1920s in Germany, when they have the tax balance that needs to be created by the companies. But that's beyond my time that I researched.
Thank you very much. Next, we have a question by Max James McDavid, and I'm going to read it. So the case of balance sheet manipulation in railways in the United Kingdom during the mid-19th century commonly features directors, chairmen manipulating the capital accounts. This typically took the form of either paying dividends out of capital, famously in the case of George Hudson, or insufficiently covering capital depreciation in the capital account in order to inflate reported profits. This allowed for inflated dividends, which helped with raising additional funds. It seems like in both the UK railway case and the German chemical case, the incentives of management are dominated by funding concerns. However, the approach is nearly the opposite. In one case, it is overstating profit in order to raise interest in equity markets, and in the other, it is understating profit to retain funds for internal financing. Can you comment more on incentives for directors, chairman here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can try. I think that the one part I already mentioned, the incentives of the directors was very obviously to withdraw from outside influence, from banks especially. But I think what you always have to take into account is the amount of shares that was held by members of the founding family in the Bayer case. So there was not for a long time there wasn't really it was kind of moving from one pocket to the other, because the shareholders at the same time, the shareholder families were at the same time also members of the management. So maybe this could be an answer or give a hint to the incentives that could explain this very different approaches. But I think that maybe the question is so complex that I would have to look into detail into it a bit more if the answer would not be sufficient.
Great, thank you. Next we have was a question and a comment by Wei Peng Yuan. So I'm gonna read both. Maybe you can expand on the comment or not, but if you can answer the question, please. So first the question, except of undervaluation of assets, depreciating assets, did they manipulate the profit through dealing with bad debts? And the comment is, we can also find this kind of case of manipulating in the later 19th century. Seems the pressure to stabilizing in 19th century China. It seems that the pressure to stabilizing the income of the clerks play a more important role than the outsiders.
To the first question, I know I can't see it anymore. I think it's still here. I didn't really find anything that was that mentioned something like bad debts in the buyer case, I'm afraid. So I cannot really give information on this. And the income of the clerks, it's a very interesting approach. I have not thought of this, and I have not come across any evidence how the income of the clerks would relate to the profits of the company. So maybe if you could elaborate a bit more on the comment, then I could give you a better answer. But that's really so. Really, there's not so much of a personal level, at least in the negotiations and debates that I was looking at. So I'm afraid I cannot really answer to that question.
Thank you. I would like to ask another question. And one of the things I like most of your presentation and your paper so far is that you're also giving a message to scholars, to academics. So basically to us in terms of the methodology of what to do when going to the archives, and motivating us to be a bit more critical towards current research, current economists who probably take data for granted. So in relation perhaps with work by Stephanie Deckers in her paper, The Silence of the Archives, which basically means that firms hide or not disclose some things or destroy them and they do not survive time, and that connected to what you're arguing of how accounts were manipulated, and that might be hard to find, to tell, and we might be building histories and narratives around data that was manipulated. So what would be your advice to us and this network of early career researchers in particular, how to approach these situations? How should we go into an archive and what to do? So yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a good and a big question. I don't think that I have so much of advice for very individual cases, because you know, if this question about the honesty of an archive or how to deal with numbers in an archive is just a side question of your real research question, then it would not, the time you would need to put into this to make sense of the numbers, as you see in my example, it was an entire dissertation basically. So that's nothing that you would just be able to do as a part of your research question. But of course, what I claim, or what would be the real solution, would be to go into all the companies in an ideal world, you would go into all the company archives of all the companies listed in the historical stock markets and do the kind of research I did for Bayer for every company in the stock market. And then you would find out how much hidden reserves there were actually and how trustworthy the numbers are. And of course, I know that this is not possible, but what I would hope is that scholars that are dealing with this sort of data, that they would reflect a bit on the data. And also what I mentioned, that I think that even though you will not be able to find numbers or hidden reserves about for a lot of companies, it might be a very good approach to look into companies that had syndicates and mergers, because we know that the time before the First World War was a time where of a lot of market concentration. And I guess, or at least that's what I hope, that in other syndicates and other industries, when you look at these negotiations, you could quite easily get an idea of balance manipulation for a lot of firms at the same time. So this might maybe be one part solution. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's a big challenge, and I wanted to push a bit there, but I think it's very important to comment on these things as well. I want to take the time to also invite you all to our next event, which will be happening on March 15th. And we'll have Meghna Chaudhry presenting Wagering on the Future, Cotton, Credit and Contract Law in Colonial Bombay. And I'll post the information on the chat in a second. And I think Manuel has another question. If you want to turn again your mic and camera, thank you.
Sure. So there might not be enough time to answer them, of course. So the two follow-up questions are, do you have a sense of how widespread the practice is across other sectors of German industry? And then does this become a permanent practice at Bayer AG? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Other industries, that's something I'm also currently looking into in order to write another paper. But that's my hope to find those cases, because as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, also for the German cases, hidden reserves is basically something that is discussed from the 1920s onwards. Marc Spörer has done some good research on this topic. And I know about companies, especially Krupp, for example, so steel companies in Germany that also start to craft different balance sheets at the same time. So in the end of the fiscal year, the management of Krupp has 3 or 4 different balance sheets that they then choose to publish. One of those, which delivers the best numbers for their individual to what they want to show the public, basically. So there are cases, but as I said, also sadly, the German case studies are very limited at the moment, and I really hope that is something that comes in the future. And sorry, the second question?
Oh, the second question had to do as to how permanent or constant this practice becomes in the future for Bayer again. Yes,
that's an interesting question, because as you might know, the chemical industry in Germany, it's really a history of more syndicates and mergers by time. So in 1916, the next step comes where 8 companies of the chemical industry form a syndicate, and then of course the big IG Farben AG that is founded in the mid 1920s and then becomes very powerful prior or during the Second World War. And during this concentration processes, you have these negotiations over and over again. And what is interesting to see is that Bayer really becomes the leader when it comes to this management accounting knowledge. And what you can observe is that there is a transfer of knowledge happening from bio into the entire chemical industry. So they make their management accounting the reference for the entire industry. And it from so during the time after 1904 until basically the formation of the IG Farben in the middle of the 1920s, Bayer becomes a role model when it comes to management accounting. So that's what I can add to this question. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Frederick. Just gonna read Wei Peng Yuan's elaborate a bit more on the comment before about China as a closing comment. So let me explain a little about the second comment. In China, there were some clerks in the company who had no wages at all. All their income was coming from the dividends or bonuses at the end of the year. So the manager should make sure most of them well paid each year.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank first Frederick for being here today and give us an excellent talk, and all you people for attending. Again, we invite you to come to our next webinar session, which will be happening in 1 month time, March 15th. And we hope to be seeing you, and we'll be posting this recording into our coming YouTube channel. So thank you, Frederick, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for your great questions, and thank you for having me. And should I answer to the last comment, or?
If you want.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is very quick, because this was not the case in German. They were all paid. They had wages, and so they were not dependent on somehow had an incentive to twist the numbers in order to get more money themselves. So, but thank you for your comment, and also thank you very much for the other comments, and see you the next time.
Thank you. See you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.